So this is the first plenary panel. If you look at the programme, you'll see there's an opening plenary, then a break, and then we're going to have workshop sessions, parallel workshop sessions. So you have to choose at that point, are you going to 1 or 2, and then choose, are you going to 3 or 4. Then there's another break, and then there's a final plenary. So we'll just, if you need any help understanding where to go, just ask one of the people with the red badges on. So this first panel, Seeking Freedom, Imagining 18th Century Black Lives in Northern England, and then I've added a long subtitle, won't be surprised you to, Anti-Racist Pedagogy and Lancaster Black History Group. It's kind of about the evolving work of Lancaster Black History Group. So first of all, just get everyone to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Lela Harris, the Artist Commission to work on the Black Lancastrians project.
Hi, I'm Geraldine Onek. I'm co-founder of the Lancaster Black History Group, and I'm also a primary school teacher in Lancaster.
And you know who I am now. Apparently a very famous person. So first, what we want to do in this session is kind of talk about and lead up to what we're actually going to do in the workshop. Is really talk about an evolving project that we've been working on, the three of us together for some time, with Lancaster Black History Group, and yeah, what it means for us, I think, to try and do anti-racist education in a kind of local and regional context. So I'm going to take us back to begin with, and what I'm going to do is curate this as a conversation with Lela and Geraldine. So I'm going to begin back in June 2020. And this is actually Petra Onek, Geraldine's sister, in Dalton Square in Lancaster, and speaking on the steps. So Geraldine, tell us what was happening in 2020 in Lancaster to begin with. Because Black Lives Matter in a way, and the movement has kind of changed your life actually in quite profound ways.
Believe it or not, I wasn't an activist from birth. So as many of you know, summer of 2020 was when George Floyd was brutally murdered, and this was televised globally. For me, and many of us, we were in our homes as part of lockdown, and here this was being televised. But for a black person, this is something this was not a shock for us. However, I think seeing something so visual, you can't hide away from it anymore. And globally, everyone reacted in different ways, from protests. And here in Lancaster, we had our own vigil in Dalton Square. And that day, actually, I deliberated going. Lancaster is my home. I came here as a child refugee. My dad studied here, gained a scholarship. So I've always seen Lancaster as a home. I've been here since age 2. However, when I did attend, you can just see the volume of people who were there. They were there to support, they were there as supporters in this movement, as I like to call it. I was astounded, these people here as our friends, people from all backgrounds, all ages, all seeing what we have been feeling for ages. And my sister took it upon herself to speak on those steps, and from the heart, talking about what it meant to have that support from our local area in Lancaster. But that day was pivotal to what then happened. I was a primary school teacher, I'm a mother as well, and I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't just a one-off thing, so what could we do next?
So I think one of the things to highlight about what happened in Lancaster, which was also happening in Bristol, was happening in Glasgow, so former port cities and towns, particularly Atlantic-facing ones, is that protesters were really focusing in what they did in their actions on historical connections of these port town cities to slavery and colonialism. So we saw that in Liverpool, Glasgow, Bristol, and in London. So there was a way in which, although these protests were initiated by police violence in the US and then travelled, they took on a particular, I would say, anti-colonial character in a British context and actually a wider European context, where we started seeing, for example, Edward Colston statue dumped in Bristol Harbour. In Glasgow, activists started changing street names that were named after tobacco merchants and sugar planters. There was this real focus on kind of rejecting the denial of these histories and how these histories can take shape racism in the present. And in Lancaster, actually, the protests moved from Dalton Square down to the quayside, which is where slave ships used to leave in the 18th century. So that was something, I think, that provided a bit of context for then you wanting to think about history, wasn't it, as a group. So do you want to talk, Geraldine, take us through who set up this group and why, what your kind of aims were?
So Rebecca, Novelle and I co-founded Lancaster Black History Group, and this was done in lockdown. We wanted to educate Lancastrians about our role in the slave trade. When you speak to people, they were unaware that we were once the 4th largest slave port, and there was a reason for this. It was hidden history. I went to school, I went to university here, I've never once learnt this information. So we were like, how can we address this in a way that our Lancastrians can learn this history? As you know, the slide before, it showed the Rawlinson Memorial. And this was a key point to how we were going to start this conversation. So someone graffitied the word slave trader on the Rawlinson Memorial, and all of a sudden conversations were being sparked. So using knowledge from professors and academics at Lancaster Uni, faith groups, we then collaborated our group, the Lancaster Black History Group, and we wanted to, in a way, educate the future by saying if you learn about your past, then you can understand what is happening now, these contemporary issues.
Yeah, and it was really important, wasn't it, that it was you and Rebecca, because Rebecca's lead social worker for refugee integration in Lancashire. So from the outset, I think, there was this very much about contemporary forms of migration, discrimination, racism, and kind of also involving a wide range of community groups in making those links between history, present and future. So we started in the pandemic doing this work, and although we focused on 18th century in the group, that isn't the only area of Black history we're going to focus on. We just knew from the Black Lives Matter protests that we needed to begin with those 18th century histories in the city. And what happened in the last few years was this incredible explosion. So although we all were in lockdown or going in and out of lockdown, which we're in a lot in the Northwest in that period, I'm sure many of you remember, we kind of thought we can start some of this community research work because there's all these online databases now and tools, research tools and methods. So things like, there's obviously David Shoga's work, which is really important. Things like the Runaway Slaves in Britain project run by Glasgow University, amazing online free data set, where you can type in Lancaster and look at historic individuals who've run away from bondage, slavery in our local area. The Centre for Study of Legacies, the British Slavery Project at UCL, which is an incredible public database which kind of tracks the money in terms of the abolition money that went to slave traders. And again, we knew that was showing up information that we didn't know about local involvement in the slavery business. And the Slave Up Voyages database, which is Nick Bradburn here at the university, is actually one of the project leads on it. It's an international project that's mapped every single slave voyage, Atlantic slave voyage, but it's doing even more work than that now. So we had experts, we had all these kind of people in the community, teachers, social workers, students. Yeah. So the group's quite diverse, and then we began this project working with schools. So we got, I think, £10,000 for a charity called Necessity to help us, and we initially did this project called Slavery Family Trees, which was mentioned briefly before, and we experimented really with methods. So I wrote the bid for this project, and the original idea was kind of inspired by the UCL project. How can we follow families locally? Like follow the money locally by doing these family trees and try and build up a picture of kind of the ways in which the local area had benefited from these kind of key merchant and slaver families in the city. And we took, I think it was 8 families, and we worked with 8 different groups in the community, 2 schools, 2 faith groups, a refugee group. Can't remember. But anyway, we talked about that project a lot, and you can look at it online.
And one of the groups which you mentioned was the secondary school I attended, Lancaster Girls Grammar School.
Oh, yeah.
And that was pivotal in terms of, I used to walk down Lindo Square to school, and yet we found out that Lindo was actually a slave merchant, and he became one of the families that we actually researched. So Girls Grammar now have embedded this as part of their history curriculum. So it's something that is not just done once and done. This is something that's going to be continuous for the future generations.
So the idea was that we didn't do the research, that these groups did the research, but we kind of guided them and gave them some tools. So that was a really good example of a group that was very close to your heart, wasn't it? Because we also found out actually that enslaved people lived, the house is still there in Lindo Square, where Lindo, who was an absolutely prolific slave trader, transatlantic slave trader and intra-Caribbean slave trader and a plantation slave owner, and actually brought enslaved servants to work in Lancaster, we discovered through this work. So yes, to start to see the kids research that, this is all online on Teams, and for them to start like giving talks to their fellow school pupils, this was like a kind of amazing thing, because this was the kind of wave that we wanted to start with the Black History Group.
So behind you, you can see the pack I actually created. So one of the barriers to this knowledge is that teachers were saying, how can we teach something that we don't know ourselves? So as a teacher, I got my ideas together, and this is not something you can just go on TES or Twinkle and download. This is something that needed to be created from scratch. So I created a actual free document that could be used by all schools locally and globally, where it tells us the history of Lancaster and its role in the slave trade. And in this was not just the background information, it was also ideas of lesson, how to deliver this in an actual classroom environment. By making it accessible, it has meant that more schools in Lancaster, more than ever, are now learning about Lancaster slave trade. So to date, 63 schools are now using this as an actual resource in a history topic of their local history. And they've also committed to ensuring that all students, before leaving primary school, that they will actually do the Lancaster slave trade trail in Lancaster.
And I think some of you might have questions, and we can explore them in the Q&A or in the workshop around why Key Stage 2. I don't know if you want to say anything about that now, because I know that's raised some, like, how can you teach these histories to younger kids? But I don't know if you want to respond as a primary teacher.
Yeah, there was obviously concern because slave trade is not a topic that is usually taught until secondary school. So my argument was, this is a contemporary issue. Slavery is still existing today in terms of modern day slavery. And yes, you can still teach this, however you do it sensitively. It's a building block, you're building the foundation knowledge. So when they do go to secondary school, this is not new information. I've taught as young as 8-year-olds a local primary school in St. Peter's School in Heysham, which is actually a key place where you will find out one of our workshops, because that was the exact location where a enslaved African ran away from. So why should we wait till later on, when the information's there? It's how we impart that knowledge to them.
So these are some of the things we've been doing as a group over the first kind of couple of years. And we've kind of begun here in the 18th century, with this 18th century history of Lancaster as a slave trading port, with these kind of local families who were enriched themselves through these trades and very connected to Liverpool. And this sort of mapping work in producing these community resources and conferences, Geraldine's education pack for teachers on this work. But then we started thinking about the limits of our methods, actually, and how we were missing kind of migrant histories partly in these methods, and we were missing, because the archive itself is colonial, we were kind of missing the agency of the black individuals who we know we're starting to discover and uncover more and more of through things like priory records, runaway database records, who we knew were living in Lancaster in the 18th century. And we began to think about, how do we do this research in a way that is about a kind of black agency? And I don't know if you want to...
So I was very aware that the first pack is more the information. So you need to know about the slave trade, how it worked, how Lancaster was involved. However, what I was very aware of, there was no black stories. And as someone, with African heritage, it's important to me that when we tell narratives, we tell the whole story. And as you know, those stories were hidden, or there was very limited historical evidence of those. So we really relied on runaway database, those who managed to escape, and we only know they existed because they were brave enough to escape, and their slave merchants and traders wanted to capture them. So using that information, that's when we start to think, we have very little, but with that little we can still make something about it. And that's when we came up with the project that Lela was later commissioned on.
So we were really coming up against, I guess, the limits of the archive. And then Judges Lodging, which is part of Lancaster Museum's approach to Black History Group, said, do you want to collaborate on a project? And we thought, we knew that this next project needed to centre black agency and questions of freedom and liberation, because some of us start to feel uneasy. Were we reproducing a kind of colonial archive, telling the story of the slavers and not telling the stories of the enslaved? So I'm going to hand over to Lela, who's going to talk about this commission, because she was the artist that the Black History Group and Judges Lodging commissioned to do this next stage of work.
Hi everybody, thank you for having me. Yes, my name's Lela, and I was the artist who was lucky enough to be commissioned to work on this fascinating project. Prior to this, I'd worked on one previous commission, which was for the Folio Society to illustrate The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. So I'd had some experience in using historical references, so photographs from 1920s, 1930s from the New York Public Library online database to try and imagine some of the characters contained within the novel. And some of those were ex-plantation workers. So I had kind of a process in mind, but when I saw this commission advertised, I was totally fascinated by how you could create portraits without any visual references at all and very limited primary resources.
Should we just explain what the commission was?
Yes, sorry. I should miss that, should I say? Do you want to say?
Yeah, so the commission had two parts. So one part was that the Judges Lodgings got a collection of furniture, mahogany furniture, which from the 17th century, made from the 17th century onwards. Lancaster was the biggest innovator of mahogany and exotic wood furniture in the 18th century because it was an Atlantic port. And this Gillows was the company, with very, very famous furniture company. And the Judges Lodging houses basically the biggest collection of Gillows furniture. And they knew they needed to reframe their Gillows collection after Black Lives Matter because they realised that they were only telling the craft Lancashire version of that furniture history and not the colonial account of those objects in that collection, i.e. the mahogany had come from the Caribbean, it had been harvested by enslaved labour, etc. So they wanted to think about how they reframe their entire Gillows collection. That was part one, and we're not going to talk about that today, but I worked on that project and I could talk to you about it. Part two was, they had portraits and objects in the museum that we knew of people who were deeply connected and from families that were deeply connected to the slave trade, the slavery business, were slave owners, or a variety of roles in that trade. And some of these were by quite famous artists.
Yeah, George Romney.
I'll let you take over now.
Yeah, George Romney, he was a very famous artist from the 18th century who also happens to come from Kendal, where I currently live. I'm originally from Manchester, but live in Kendal, so some of his fine portraits up on the wall. But however, they were the fine portraits were of the wealthy white elite of Lancaster who benefited from slavery, and there was no representation of the people whose labour lined the pockets of these wealthy merchants. So the commission was really to kind of readdress that imbalance within the museum's collections and tell a fuller story of Lancaster's history and its links to the 18th century transatlantic slave trade and the West Indies trade as well. Shall I talk about my process? So basically, in terms of being an artist, being commissioned to create portraits of people that you don't know what they look like, actually, some people would think that was really scary, but for me it was really exciting because nobody knows what these people look like. So it's an opportunity to use your imagination and primary resources to create a starting point for other people to imagine what these people could look like, and in that way to humanise them and to give a starting point for you to think about what these people's lives were like during the 1700s in Lancaster. So the way I approached it, when we started way back in 2022, is that right? Yeah. Way back. Yeah. Was to kind of really tap into the amazing partnerships that I'd developed on the project already. So Imogen mentioned previously there was Lancaster Black History Group, Lancaster University, UCLan, faith groups, and lots of kind of like family histories that were available. So I benefited from the research that was already done before. So I researched the research and used things like the Runaway database by Glasgow University, the baptism and burial records at the primary church to give myself a starting point. And then from the list of, I think there was about 39 baptism and burial records at the Priory Church, we kind of whittled it down to 10 people of interest whose stories had already been explored a little bit in the Slavery Family Trees project. People that I was interested in from the information gathered from the baptism records. And I kind of developed kind of like a bio for each of this list of 10 people, which was then presented to the commissioning group to see how we could develop these portraits. So I split my information up into what we knew as facts, which I had to get Imogen to check quite a lot, and Geraldine. What was conjecture, so what could we infer from those facts? Connections that I could find between the museum, so the Judges Lodgings Museum, also connections to Lancaster in terms of its architecture and how it developed, and also the wealthy elite that were based in Lancaster during that time, and also to contemporary issues, so i.e. what was happening at the Rawlinson Memorial at the Priory Church as well, and also within the collections within the museum, so that could be pieces of furniture as well. And then I had my own thoughts about these individuals and how I could kind of develop an emotional picture of what these black individuals were going through during that time, during the 18th century. So this is an example of one of the fact sheets or bios I did for one of the portrait candidates.
You probably can't see it, so I'm going to run through at the back. Yeah.
So this is a Runaway advert that is contained on the Glasgow Runaways database, and it's for an individual known as Ibu Boy, who ran away from his master, the Reverend Clarkson in Heysham, at the age of 16. Do you want me to read through it, or no?
Yeah.
Oh, well. So I'll read out the advert for those who can't see at the back. So it says, this is from the Edinburgh Evening Courant on the 5th of October 1765, and this advert was then placed again in 3 subsequent newspapers for the return of this boy. So I'll read it out now. So it says, run away from the house of Reverend Mr. Clarkson, rector of Heysham, near Lancaster, early in the morning of Monday the 26th of August, a Negro boy of the Ibu country, slender made, about 5 foot 3 inches high, with beautiful features for a black. His age 16 years, his left knee bending inwards, which makes him halt, a small lump on his forehead with his country marks and his temples, had on, when eloped, a blue jacket, a grey cloth waistcoat, and leather breeches. He speaks broad Lancashire dialect. Whoever brings him to his master at Heysham, or to his said master's brother, Mr. William Clarkson, surgeon in Drury Lane, Liverpool, or to Peter Lennox, Perth, shall be well rewarded, and all charges paid. And whoever harbours him shall be prosecuted with the utmost severity of the law. So this piece of information, which is harrowing in itself about this young boy's escape, provided some really amazing physical description of what this young boy could have looked like. So I knew how tall he was, I knew he was slender, I knew what clothes he was wearing, I knew that how he walked with a limp, I knew he had a lump on his forehead, and scarification marks, which all this information can infer quite a lot in terms of what he looked like physically and also what maybe he was going through emotionally. So the fact that he had a broad Lancashire dialect suggested that he'd been in Lancashire for a long time, and also made me think about how intelligent this young boy must have been to have learned another new language so well that he had a broad Lancashire dialect. We knew that he was born in Africa because he had country marks on his temples, which would refer to scarification marks, which he may have received from his tribe. We knew, therefore, that he was from modern-day Nigeria because it's referred to in the Runaway advert. So suddenly, a dry piece of what I would call dry, but obviously it's quite interesting, piece of historical information can provide a really fantastic visual reference starting point for me as an artist to develop the portrait. We hope that he wasn't found by the Reverend Clarkson because he's not referred to in his will as well. So when I was developing this portrait, I spent more time researching these individuals than I did actually drawing the portraits, because for me, trying to convey an emotional portrait of a person is much more interesting than maybe a physical resemblance, although that is, inferred in this particular portrait. So when I was developing the piece, I was thinking, what I kept coming back to was, what was his real name? Was he an orphan? Was he forcibly separated from his parents? Why wasn't he baptised? Because Reverend Clarkson hadn't baptised him at the church in Heysham. And also, how long he must have spent in Heysham to develop this broad accent, which actually was a distinguishing feature for him to be recaptured, which was used against him. But did this accent suggest that he'd made lots of friends within his local community? Did somebody help him to escape? So all these things, what's the next slide? Slowly helped me to start to pull together what this person could look like. So the portrait of Ibu Boy, which is now called Afem Fuma, thanks to the young people that worked on the schools workshops and to the amazing work that Geraldine did with the young people to kind of give them an idea of the culture that this young person came from. The name Afem Fuma means?
My name will not be lost.
Which I think is really powerful, that he's been given a name that represents his culture and connecting the past to the present and ownership from the young people on this powerful story. So the final piece, you're going to have to go to the museum to see the portrait until the 5th of November, so you better get there quick. It's basically a collage piece, and you can see the portraits in the education pack, which are just at the back of the room, which we're going to show off in a little while. And it's like a mixed media piece with charcoal, coloured pencils, ink and paint, and I kind of wanted to get across, like I have done in many of the portraits, that although we all look different and we all have different lives, we're all the same. Ultimately we're all the same underneath. So I like that way when I'm working with different mediums.
Yeah. Before we just move on to the thing, I think one of the things that when we were working with Lela while she was doing this work, and in my case I do lots of boring stuff to read.
I read it all.
But we were thinking a lot about the kind of the black radical tradition, and kind of work on slavery and recuperating slavery histories in a way that honours black agency. So I've sent stuff to Lela and we were WhatsApping all the time. And I was also, Sadia Hartman's work became quite important because she talks a lot about the limits of the colonial archive, the slavery archive, what it means to kind of work with, she uses the term fabulations, I think, to talk about how do you work at the limit of fact to kind of, so you don't reproduce the violence of people whose lives have been reduced to property, but you try and capture actually their fullness, their full lives. So we were kind of to and froing around how to draw on these kind of black traditions and this kind of radical traditions in thinking around archives and colonial archives. And also we're thinking a lot about haunting. So Lela, I don't know if you want to talk about that, because I was thinking about the sociology of haunting, in particular Avery Gordon's work and the way in which we have to allow ourselves in a way to be haunted by the past, and how haunting and ghosts can change something. And for me, Petra Onek's speech was a haunting moment in 2020, the Black Lives Matter protests. It was kind of like a moment for me of haunting that kind of shifted something, and it felt like all these ghosts were flowing out into the city. And then Lela started talking to me about being a medium when she was doing the work, so I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean,
woo!
It's going to be spooky now. Well, it is Halloween, isn't it? Yeah, I think when I was speaking to Imogen and Geraldine and other members of the group, so because I spent so long researching these individuals, and I had, bits of facts stuck up on my studio wall. I had printouts of some of the wealthy white elite portraits that were in the museum up there while I was working on these 6 portraits. And for some portraits, in particular Thomas Anson, I'd be working away thinking about, I really need to get that portrait of Thomas Anson done quick because the deadline's coming up and I don't really know where to start. And then one day I started on a Friday and I picked up a paintbrush and I thought, I'm just going to map this out. But actually, I'm just going to test some colours. I'm not really going to do a portrait because I've done the 4 portraits, but I thought I'll just see what happens here. Because the commission was for 4, but I've ended up doing 6 portraits because I'm a try-hard, and in case 2 of them were rubbish, I did 6, but all 6 were good, so that was good. But when I was working on Thomas's portrait, I picked up the brush and I thought, okay, I'm just going to see what happens here. And the next thing you know, it's Monday, and this amazing, I'm not being big-headed, but I don't think I could paint this portrait again. And it kind of felt like everything had come together, like you were saying about being haunted and maybe me being a medium for what Thomas went through and what he was feeling, because I'd spent so long getting to know him. And this portrait came out and I stepped back on Monday, I was like, it's done, it's really, sometimes you're like, whoa, I'm Einstein levels, this is really good. And other times you think that's going straight in the bin, but that was one of those moments where I thought, I'm not even sure I know how I painted that, but I did. I can confirm I have the progress photos. I did paint it, but sometimes I think the drawing or the portrait or the subject takes over and the work happens by itself, and those moments are the best moments, I think, as an artist.
We'll talk a bit about that, about the role of kind of the imagination, because I think that's really, these ideas have then really driven us into thinking about what kind of schools resources that we want to produce, and that we've now drafted that we're going to share with you, because that role of a kind of imagination, both in the research side and in the art side and in the teaching side, actually has kind of been this point of intersection, I think, for the 3 of us. Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk about, alongside Lela producing what became 6 portraits that are now part of the permanent collection of the museum, and are positioned in relationship to these portraits of enslavers, etc., which are incredibly powerful, so you must go to Judges Lodging to see them if you haven't already. Lela and Geraldine ran at young people's workshops, so I'm just going to get them to talk about, because that's really inspired us, hasn't it, those workshops. Totally, yeah. What you did in those workshops.
Do you want to cover, because Geraldine did the history element of it and the cultural element, and I did the art bit, so I think the Geraldine's bit informs my bit, so I'll let you go.
Yeah, so when you compete with art, I need to make sure this was interactive and fun and engaging, because history can be seen as this subject where we just impart knowledge, learning facts, and we didn't want that to be the case. So using the story of Igbo Boy, now known as Afamefuna, we used the exact resource of the Runaway advert, and we got children to infer and say, okay, this is what we know about him, why do you think he ran away? And we started to get them to use their imagination, like, what do you think his journey was like? So we know he came from Nigeria, so we looked at that on the globe to see how far that was. He must have gone through the Caribbean most likely, and then come to Haitian. And so we worked together to make sure whatever I taught in the morning session was then used in order to create a storyboard. So because they knew the possible route he may have taken, they were able to create these visual storyboards using the historical information from the morning session. And we also did a lot of dramatization, role play. So this was then making him seem as not a victim, because that's what we didn't want. You know, a lot of the stories, when you do hear about enslaved Africans, it's victimization, and we wanted to make him a person, a human, a hero in his own story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the first time I've ever taught young people, and it was terrifying, but it was totally exhilarating. I found it a really inspiring process, and because I hadn't finished the portraits yet, I think it did kind of contribute to how I created the artworks in the end. So we worked with over 120 local school children over a period of about 5 weeks. Geraldine did the kind of history of the cultural element in the morning, even got them to dress up in Nigerian clothes. They lay together on the floor to experience what it'd be like in close quarters on a slave ship as well. So they really were, you know, they were invested in this story. They were embedded in what Ibu's boys, Afenfuma's life was like. And then when I worked with them, we did some portrait drawing sessions of what they imagined him to look like, and we used the...
Were they year 6?
Yeah, year 6 primary school, yeah. From, was it which schools? Barroom, Cathedral?
And Dallas Road.
And Dallas Road, primary schools, yeah. And when they came into the sessions, they were a bit terrified when they found out they were going to do portraits. And they were like, I can't draw a face, I can't do it. And I was like, we totally can, because a face is just shapes. And we went through the process of how you can split a face into shapes and light and dark. So we did the practical process of how you make a portrait, but then because they were so invested in this boy's emotional story, that came across in their artwork as well. So they did these fantastical portraits which are on display as part of the young people's exhibition at the museum. I mean, the portraits are so good that people have asked to buy them, and their work has like been confused for mine. Like, are these your in-process portraits? And I'm like, no, this is like the incredible work of these young people. And then in the afternoon we did these pull-out storybooks of Ibu Boy's journey either from Africa to Lancaster or his amazing escape from Hesham, and which just in this photo here, and you'll get to do some of these this afternoon if you join our workshop. It'll be very good, some colouring in. But because they were so invested in the story, it was almost like he was a member of their class. When they did this imagination process, they weren't frightened or upset. They were really rooting for him to make his bid for freedom. They had dragons helping him. They had fantastical birds. He made friends on the way. And they were like, can we do that, miss? Because it's not part of, 1700s, 18th century. She was like, who knows what happened then? Anything could have happened. And I was just totally made up with how proud of themselves they were when they'd finished and the work that they produced. So I think it was a really powerful way of embedding that learning and that gap between historical fact and imagination, and now they'll be able to tell that story to other people that they meet, to friends, to their kids when they grow up. So I think combining history and art is really powerful in that way.
Okay, so from Lela's portrait work, from the kids' workshops, from thinking about the limits of the previous Family Trees project that we'd done with Black History Group, we began to think about what a resource would look like in this space. So given this incredible work that Geraldine and Lela did with the kids, and then which has taken off in lots of ways, and lots of teachers are getting trained to teach this on curriculums, what does schools' resource look like that kind of embedded those principles of kind of fabulation, that could both do history, this is historical fact, these are historical facts, but could also have exercises that allowed the kids to use their imaginations to kind of make connections with these as individuals and to kind of bring them to life. So that's what we've been working on together, the three of us, is this next stage of the project, which we've now got the draft of. So in our workshop today, we're going to be thinking about working with you on the draft of this resource and doing one of the exercises that we did that we've created for kids, for teachers and educators using the classroom. And it's Key Stage 2, but I think it could be Key Stage 3 as well, actually. I think you could just level it up, but with Geraldine as the primary teacher, we've made it Key Stage 2 appropriate. It's quite hard to think about how do you deal with these histories and teach them to kids that age? And that's been one of the things we have to keep checking in all the time with each other around what language to use, how much detail about the scale of the horror do you have in, how do you do that? Teach that. But we also kind of all, I think, believe that teaching it to Key Stage 2 is really important. And I think we got confident. Your confidence with doing the workshops has shown us the massive impact that can have if you do teach it at a younger age and don't just teach it as kind of more formal history curriculum at secondary, which is slightly different. So do you want to talk about the pack? I can't remember why we decided to do the pack now.
Why did we decide? Because it's awesome. I think because the skills workshops went so well, and it was to give a kind of black perspective on what it was like for these individuals during the 18th century, and for basically to give kids skills so they could be history detectives who are all really inspired about how they would go about finding things out for themselves and be empowered and not be scared about combining history and art. Because I think a lot of time because I'm not an academic, I kept thinking I was going to get told off with the red pen for the things I'd imagined. But I think if we give them the skills and the confidence earlier on, then I think that's a wonderful combination.
We have been told off a few times,
have.
Just so you know, by some historians. But so we've always got them in our mind, haven't we, and how we kind of are really clear about what's historical fact and what is an exercise in creative imagination. Yeah. But we weren't going to limit ourselves not to do that because of that little argument.
And the pack is aimed at kids can take themselves through the pack with support from a teacher, but they can work through it as exercises as well. So it's like you can set a session and they can either work in pairs or they can work on their own, because the voice, the narrator in the pack is Geraldine as our Dora the Explorer history detective, and she takes them through what it was like for her in Lancaster as a young person growing up, and then she introduces you to Afa, to Thomas, to Francis, and gets you to imagine with the use of illustrations and maps and primary sources what their lives could have been. And we're really clear in the pack that this is one way that we've imagined it, but obviously it's a starting point. So hopefully it'll go down well.
Yeah, so Geraldine the Explorer, and this is Geraldine at school. And we do talk, so we actually have written this, we've written this together in the same room, so we're like reading it out loud to each other. So we've got in Geraldine talking about experiencing racism at primary school in Lancaster, growing up here as a refugee from South Sudan, and we've got her journey from South Sudan, and we've got Geraldine as a teenager. So we're trying to kind of use Geraldine, not use Geraldine, but as a conduit, as a kind of point of identification. So then she's going to take you to meet the people, these black individuals from history. There's 3 stories that we've included in the book, and actually one's a very much a Lancaster story, one's a Heysham story, and one is a Cumbrian story, because we had to decide which stories to tell, and I think we wanted it to be a bit wider than just Lancaster, and to be, I mean obviously it's global, and we tell the stories of where these people have come from as well in the book, so it's a migration stories too. So that's what we're going to be doing in the workshop, but if you're not in our workshop, then you're very welcome to have a look at the packs as well, that we give us any feedback before we do the final drafts on them.
Yes, so the legacy of the project, it's really nice because it was written into the project and the commission at the beginning that the portraits would be hopefully part of the permanent collection, which I assume means if they were good enough they were going to be part of the permanent collection. Thankfully they've jumped across that hurdle and now part of the permanent collection. But I'm super inspired by the partnership work and everybody involved in the project, that the portraits and the project has got a bigger life outside of the museum. So one such thing is Light Up Lancaster Festival. Anybody heard of Light Up Lancaster? Yeah, very good. So it's happening next week, and through the amazing team at Light Up Lancaster who've commissioned Leo and Hyde, which is a production company, through the power of technology, AI, me chipping in every now and again, they've brought the portraits to life, so they'll be alive coming out of the museum. They'll be looking around across the streets of Lancaster, and it'll be telling their stories from their perspective about their time here. So it's got visual and audio, and it is incredible. So please go and see it between the 2nd and the 4th.
We're not allowed to show you a clip.
No,
because
it's
top
embargoed.
secret, embargoed till next Thursday.
Yeah.
But basically, this is the front of the Judgesology Museum, and the whole thing will be moving with sound. And Leila's voice reading out, I think it's around 60 individuals now.
Oh yeah.
Who we've identified as black individuals in Lancaster in the 18th century. So we're finding more and more and more actually. But like reading out their names, but having some of Leila's images and other images exploding across the front of the museum. So yeah, we feel like we're kind of really bringing black history into the city now in a quite spectacular way. So just to finish on the theme of today, this is my dining room table. So this is where we've been working together over the last 6 months.
6 months, I think, yeah.
On these teaching resources, but we've been working together a lot longer now. But on this particular resource, and I think it just because of the who do you think we are aspect, it would be really good for us to say something about what the personal impact of this work on us has been. I don't know if you want to begin, Jo?
Yeah. You know, as a teacher, and I'm always aware now that when I'm teaching, I need to make sure those gaps aren't there where they were for me as a student. So when we create resources like this, it gives me hope for the next generation. You know, as we all know, it's Black History Month right now, and you know, schools will be teaching some elements of Black history, but what we're trying to do is embed it, so Black history just becomes history, and it's everyone's history. You can't tell the story of colonialism without telling the stories of those enslaved Africans. You can't celebrate Gillows without mentioning those people who actually harvested the mahogany. And that's what we're just trying to do. We're trying to tell the whole narratives and make children critical thinkers, you know, question, you know, these things like, why did this happen? Why is it impacting today? Because a lot of children see history as something that's done rather than ongoing. They're living it now, you know, Lancaster, the whole landscape's changing in terms of people reacting to the things that they've discovered, in terms of like Robert Gillow Pub changing its name as a result of knowing. So it's just showing them that you can change your opinion and it's not factual and that's it, you know, it stays. You can be open to different ideas of what history is and how we interpret it. That's it for me.
On a personal level, after Black Lives Matter, you went from kind of not engaging with kind of black activism to becoming a kind of activist and leader in our community on that. What does that feel like?
It has changed me personally. You know, I used to shy away from this because I was very aware that I was already a minority in a city, a very white city.
It's actually disproportionately white. It's like 97% white. And actually the largest migrant population is actually white European, Eastern Europe. So it's actually more white than most places in England are, just to say. So teaching Black history here is a different meaning, or a particular meaning, and I won't go bore on about that, but go on.
But I do think, it makes me appreciate that even in a white-dominated area, people do want to learn about this history, and it's just ensuring that it's happening and it's not a tokenistic thing. I think what we're doing is, you know, something that's going to be happening in years to come, and I hope, you know, as a mother as well, I'm very aware that they are very aware, like representation, you know, diversifying the curriculum, making sure that representative in all areas of the curriculum rather than just history, you know, so that's what it means to me personally.
Well, I think I've changed loads actually whilst working on this project. I've learned a lot about myself as an artist and feel more confident as an artist because I only taught myself to draw and paint about 4 years ago, so I'm still feel very raw and shiny new, and like I have imposter syndrome all the time, but now I'm starting to feel a lot more confident about introducing myself as an artist. And then for me personally as well, I didn't know a lot about myself before this project. Like, I'm from Manchester, from a single parent family. My mum was white Irish and I had no idea who my dad was, and I think working on this project made me interested in who I was and what my heritage was and how that informs who I am today. And it's something that I've been too scared to kind of find out about for a long time. My mum's no longer with us anymore, so I wasn't able to ask her. So working on this project and finding out where these individuals came from made me brave enough to get a DNA test. So I got a DNA test, and then because I wanted to find out on my paternal side where my dad was from, and I found out where my dad was from, and then thanks to Imogen being like Sherlock Holmes, figured out who my dad was. So now I know who he was. I've not made contact yet, but it's like something that I've been really scared about. Now I have the answers to, and I think that's just so powerful about how the past can inform the present and who you are. So I just think it's been an amazing project to work on.
And for me, there's a very personal part of this project, because I grew up in a village not that far from Lancaster called Dent. And one of the individuals that Lela painted, I think she included him for me before I finished it.
That was the magic one, that was Thomas.
Thomas Anderson, who was this individual I first found out about when I was 15, growing up in this very remote village in the Yorkshire Dales, who'd run away from the village. And I did this, when I was 15, I did a GCSE project on slavery in the local area. And I knew about Thomas's story then, but only very little. I knew his name, and that he'd run away from a farmhouse in the village. So in a way, Lela painted, doing the research in the community. I'm actually working for a researcher in Jamaica now, and I've done a huge amount more research on the relationship between that village I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, and the plantation and slave owners who lived in that village. There's a huge oral history in the village, but there's actually been a deficit of fact, historical fact in this case. So I've been working with this Jamaican researcher on that history. But for Lela to paint Thomas was so moving for me, because it's been part of my life, that story, for so long. And to see him come to life has been like incredible. And we know he escaped, and we know he stayed escaped, so you'll find out his stories in the book. So that's been brilliant to do. So yeah, so it's kind of taken me back to teenage Imogen. Thank God, not all teenage Imogen. That's quite wild. And kind of ignited this new project, and I'm now working with a museum in Cambridge called the Sedgwick Museum, because there's a connection between this village in the Yorkshire Dales that I'm from, plantation slave money and compensation money, and what's actually the biggest and most important geological collection at Cambridge University, which was actually funded, it turns out, by the money from this plantation that was owned by this Yorkshire Dales family. So all these connections start, once you start doing connected sociologies and connected histories, it kind of changes everything, So to be working with someone in Jamaica at the moment on that research is kind of doing something it's very personal to me to go back to in terms of my own history. But yeah, and also with these histories are dark, but we have so much fun doing this work together. I'm making friends with each of us, so that's changed us all too, I think. So we've got a little bit of time. We started a bit late, but don't want to go too much into the break, but and we will have an opportunity. If you don't come to our workshop, we'll have an opportunity to talk to you at the break about the work, and if you talk at Teaching Pat. But just to open up, I realise I've not really given a context for some of this history here, so it's assuming in a way you've got some working knowledge. But if you've got any questions for any of us now at this point, please do fire away. Nicola, and then, sorry, one question here.
Sorry, thanks, Sarah. I was just going to ask, when you were searching up the historical figures, were there some that were harder to find out information about than others?
Oh yeah, there was actually, yeah. I mean, for some of them, my favourite in particular was Molly, and we only had her baptism and burial record, and the fact that she was called Molly and she was aged 20, baptism date and a burial record. But the dates between the baptism and burial record was only 3 weeks, which is kind of like heartbreaking. And then that made me think, like the rest of the team was like, that's really, really limited information. How are you going to create a portrait out of that? But my daughter's middle name's Molly, so I became interested in a personal level because of that. And I was like, there must be some way we can connect her. And then when I looked into it, it turns out that the year that Molly came to Lancaster was the same year that the Maritime Museum, which was the Customs House then, was built, and it was built by Gillows. So then you can see all these connections back to her journey here is is a way of highlighting how Lancaster changed as a city, how the River Loon was widened, the customs house was built, all to facilitate the transatlantic slave trade. And Molly's story was like, was she ill on the journey over here? Was she here for a while, got sick, somebody cared enough about her to get her baptised and then buried? It's like all these possibilities came alive from the tiniest bit of information. So I think even with the tiniest crumb in the archives, you can create a starting point, and it might be that, 20 years time somebody finds out more information about Molly, but if you don't celebrate those crumbs, I think you can lose a lot of contextual information about how a city can develop.
We should have had portraits.
I know.
Molly's the portrait of Molly is like incredible.
Got to make them go to the museum.
Yeah. Nicola.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this kind of reflection on the kind of the gruesomeness of the history, and I'm thinking about what I learned when I was in Key Stage 2 at school, and thinking about actually quite a lot of the kind of the popularisation of history for children through things like horrible histories. And I was wondering about how much that informed it, because I suppose one of the key things that I was taught about 5 times before I was 11 was about Henry VIII and the beheading and execution of his wives, for example. So I just wondered about, is there something, it's a provocation more than anything else, is there something different about how we deal with the horror of the histories that you're talking about? I'm assuming that there is, by the way. It's not that I don't think that there is. And how you manage that in the classroom.
Yeah. So there is one particular story, Frances Elizabeth Johnson, and when we started the Lancaster Black History Group, we used our social media platforms in a way to engage, because it was locked down and so people couldn't go and meet in person. And one of the stories we shared was Frances Elizabeth Johnson. So she was a slave servant who lived at 20 Castle Park, and why her story stood out was, it is believed that when she died, the Satterthwaite family mummified her hand and kept it as a heirloom, and they hung it above their fireplace. And then this was then passed down the generations, and only till 1997 did one family member actually say, this doesn't sit right with me, and want to do something about it. And we discussed, didn't we, like, should this story be told when we're showing children the trail, but we don't want to glorify or make that the sole purpose of her story, because at the end of the day we want to respect she was a person, a human, although we talk about where her hand is currently buried, and that's in the Priory Gardens, and what we are doing in order to memorialise her and acknowledge her as a person. So yeah, it is a way in, but we're very sensitive to the information and make sure that doesn't become her story.
So the trail we're talking about is that there's a slave, Professor Alan Rise developed for a long time, has run a slave trail walk of Lancaster, which now with the Black History Group we've adapted so it really stresses Black agency
as well.
Yeah, the maps at the back. But we also then, Geraldine developed a children's trail, so a children's version of the walk, and that's been adapted now. So I think, how many teachers have done it now through Faith in the Past?
There's going to be 63, isn't there?
63
yeah.
teachers, primary school teachers will have done the children's trail. So on the trail you can sometimes introduce things like the horror, of that story. And Alan Rice has written very beautifully, by the way, about Frances Elizabeth Johnson's story and the oral history of the relative who decided to do something with this horrific thing she'd inherited, this hand. But we actually decided not to include it in the teaching pack, for example. So these are the sorts of things we've had to think really carefully about, because I think in context, on the trail, you can perhaps tell the story when you go to the memorial, but it's not appropriate out of context to put the story of the hand in a teaching pack that could be taught anywhere in England. We don't know who's going to teach this. So we've had to think all the time about those ethical questions, how to balance them. And we might not have got it right, of course. And partly we want to bring the draft today to get your feedback on where we've got it right or where we haven't. But we spent a huge amount of time talking about it. So yeah. Paul?
I've been to see the portraits at the Judges Lodge University, Lela, and I would urge everybody to go and see them. They're fantastic. And Imogen, you were talking about the theory of haunting. Do you feel like the portraits are haunting the museum in one way as well? You know, sort of. Maybe that's not a very positive image, but it's like saying, you know, we're still here and. You know, we're haunting the people that brought us here as well.
Yeah.
So just, you know, you saying that.
Yeah. Well, in sociology, every Gordon's work is, and there are lots of scholars who use this concept of haunting now. And in fact, we went to a dance piece, Lela and I, the other night, that was using haunting as a theme around colonialism at this very university. But it's actually a very positive. Haunting isn't a bad thing. What's bad is denialism. So what's bad is the kind of the repression and the denialism that goes on, and we've seen in the backlash to, you know, Black history movement since Black Lives Matter, this current wave of Black history movement, and the denialism. And Chris, I'm going to say his name wrong, Manjaprara writes about this in his recent work on haunting. Yeah, that actually produces social trauma, is the repression. And I think it really reminded me of reading Chris's Manjaprara's work of you, Geraldine, talking about the social cost of not knowing as an African child in Lancaster that other Africans are literally living in the house next to the school that you were going into to learn about transatlantic slavery in a box, as though it's something that happened in the past and over there. Not literally here in houses that would still exist, and not literally was powering the economy of this city in the boom that happened here in the 18th century. So in a way, allowing yourself to be haunted, I think, is a kind of ethic that's kind of central to this project. So yeah, to me, haunting is like a really positive thing that we have to allow ourselves to be.
Definitely, I think as well, it is definitely a positive haunting of the space. And actually, it's not haunting because they're very much there in the space. They're not hidden away. They're part of the house now. And I don't think any of us were prepared, especially me, about the emotional impact that they've had on people who visited the museum. So happy to report visitor numbers are up. The visitors are much more diverse in the space, and I don't think I was prepared, especially on the opening or when people have just emailed me randomly to say that they've been to see the exhibition, like people crying when they've come into the space because as a person of colour, as a black person, they've felt seen for the very first time in a period house in the city that they live in. And I just think that's an incredible outcome for the whole team, that it's had that impact. So yeah, I think that it's definitely a positive haunting, but I do feel they're very much there in the museum.
Yeah, so we're going to finish the session now, but we'll be around at the break if you want to ask any of us questions about any of this. And thanks so much for listening. It's been great to share the work we've been doing together with you. Thank you.